Today's discussion is about democracy, and we actually are deep in the midst of the democratic process here in Oregon. It's going to be about a little bit about the past, a little bit about a future vision, and really a discussion of current events, specifically ballot measure 90, which is probably the most contentious and interesting measure on the ballot today. So, this is actually the title of the measure that's on the ballot. Sounds pretty simple. It changes some nomination processes. But if you're paying attention to the public dialogue, you'll notice something interesting, which is that this measure has spawned one of the biggest disinformation campaigns the state has ever seen. Both of our two major political parties have agreed to team up and fight the measure together by telling their own voters that the other side is going to get the advantage if the measure passes. The Republicans are sending a message to all the Republicans saying the Democrats are going to get the advantage. And the Democrats are sending messages to all the Democrats saying the Republicans are going to get the advantage if the measure passes. And both of them are saying, follow the money to these big, scary out-of-state billionaires who are bankrolling a lot of the effort. What they don't tell you is that, like Mark Zuckerberg and Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, is that these guys have actually taken the billionaire giving pledge, in the case of Mike Bloomberg, to give away all of his money before he dies to causes that he believes in. So what's gotten all of our state's partisan elites in such a twitter that they're willing to put down their differences in a valiant defense of the status quo? And more importantly, really, why should you care, right? This is the vote, right? I mean, we're talking about voting. It's not like it's really an important issue. And there are important issues, right? Like, guns and education and the environment and the declining bee population, foreign policy, domestic policy, and so on. But it turns out that whatever actual policy areas you care about, the one issue that is fundamental to every single issue in politics is the vote, right? The vote is our system of public elections that we use once every couple of years to choose the people who make every single public policy choice for us. So the vote, it's like the container for all of politics, and it's broken. Earlier this year, Princeton and Northwestern released a study proving that our democracy functions not on behalf of we the people as a whole, but instead that it operates on behalf of a polarized constellation of special interests. That time and time again, the will of the majority, which is often a broad consensus that crosses all the political ideologies, is thwarted by partisan manipulations on behalf of narrow, well-funded groups. This was not the deal from the beginning, right? The founders actually prescribed a very specific set of requirements to ensure that the government would not answer to the few at the expense of the many. And chief amongst these principles is this idea of one person, one vote. That in the selection of our representatives, our votes are to carry equal weight. But they don't. There are fundamental inequalities in the weight of the vote itself, and those inequalities are what lead directly to sort of the hyper-partisan outcomes we see on the federal level, as well as provide really fertile ground for manipulation on behalf of moneyed interests. As it has been since ancient times, the test for equality of weight is balance. Right? Lady Justice holds her scales. You put one thing on one side, one thing on the other. If they balance out, they weigh the same amount. So what does that mean for voting? A voting system provides equality of weight if and only if, for every way that you can vote in an election, for every way you can express your opinion, that there exists a counterbalancing vote that I can cast that leaves the outcome the same before and after our two votes are counted. Right? And we know this intuitively because every time there are two candidates in the race, if I vote for Alice and you vote for Bob, our votes balance out, and so the overall election outcome reflects the will of the majority of the voters. But because our current system limits us to just one choice, every time there are more than two candidates, the more similar ones split their supporters' votes. Right? So our current voting system, because you're limited to one choice, actually gives more advantage, gives a greater weight to voters who like just one candidate than those who like more than one. We actually have a name for this. We call it the spoiler effect. We call it vote splitting. At its root, it is an inequality in the vote, and it causes really horrible things to happen. The horrible thing that it causes to happen is that people tell you, look, don't actually vote for that candidate that you really like. Instead, choose the lesser evil in order that you prevent your worst outcome from happening. This just gives a huge, sneaky advantage to the guys with the money, because the lesser evil is just one of the two. It's sort of like the more tolerable of the two candidates who are most beholden to the money. The strongest candidates, the one the media says are electable, those are really the only two viable choices under our current election system. And independents who don't have big backing don't even get a fair count. Instead, we vilify them for participating, because the better the better they do, the more likely it is that their presence on the ballot will cause the election of the greater evil. And this spoiler effect inequality has been known for a long, long time. And it is what actually creates our two-party dominated system, which is why it's sort of ironic that the major party coalition opposing this ballot measure is actually quoting Ralph Nader's Tweedledee Tweedledum refrain and telling us that the state's minor parties will be destroyed if this measure passes, even though a supermajority of voters represented by those minor parties actually endorse the measure. But wait, there's more. So this is talking about a single election. We actually have two elections every cycle. The primary election was created more than a century ago to allow the voters to have the choice of which candidate would go on the general election ballot. So before the primary existed, general election candidates in the two parties were just simply chosen, either in the smoke-filled back rooms by the party insiders or at party conventions. But unfortunately, this effort, which was really to give more voice to the people, created another dimension of inequality in the vote, which is partisan exclusion. So now nearly a third of the voters, at last count 32.1%, are not in a major party, and so they can't participate in the primary. And for this room, it's actually much worse. So of the 40 and under crowd, 49% of voters under 40 are not in one of the two major parties. And if you just registered within the last several months, odds are very good that you didn't select to join a major party. 80% of new registrants in Oregon elected not to join a major party. And that's really a particular problem because the overwhelming majority of our districts in the state are safe, right? They call them safe districts. What does it mean that a district is safe? Who's it safe for? Who's it safe from? Well, a safe district is a district that has such an advantage for one party that whomever is chosen in their primary always wins the general election. So much so that they often run unopposed in the general election. So because our districts provide so many of our districts provide just one party with so much of an advantage, the determinative choice of our representation for 80% of our representatives is made only by one party in that party's primary. And that, when you add up the number of people who aren't in a major party and the number of people who are in a major party but are on the other side of the safety equation, it's more than half of the voters. It's 51% of us have effectively zero voice and representation. So that's our status quo. We have a system that heavily favors, by the spoiler effect, those candidates who have the most money, and we have an election system that divides us by party and creates these hyperpartisan outcomes. So California and Washington created a new kind of primary election to fix that whole partisan exclusion problem, right? Instead of segregating the voters by major party or not, everyone gets the same ballot, and the two who get the most votes, regardless of party, move on to the next step at the general election. So the vote between the top two, well, it's a vote between two. It's always an equal choice. But what about the first step, right? What about how do you figure out who get to be in the top two? It turns out that California's system actually doesn't have any requirement of an equal choice in that first stage. Actually, you read their law, it subtly reinforces that limit of one. So in California, what you see is actually a magnification of that spoiler effect that causes us to vote for the lesser evil candidate. Election costs have increased, and in some cases, both candidates who advance don't at all represent the majority of the voters. There's a big difference in the way that the Oregon law is written. None of the 30 sections of Oregon's Measure 90 reference a limit of one choice. Quite the opposite. In its very first operative paragraph, Measure 90 requires the legislature to create an equal vote, not just in the second stage, but also in the first stage, where we all will have the equal ability to select those two finalist candidates. But what does that mean? How do you, if you've got more than two on the ballot, how do you make an equal vote? So it turns out that that choice of a single favorite is the simplest rank ordering voting system, right? Just pick your one favorite. There are other rank order voting systems like instant runoff voting that let you rank multiple candidates, first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice, and so on. But it turns out that every single rank ordered voting system fails the test for equality of weight. Why? Because if you put just one choice on the ballot, there is no way for me to cast a vote that actually balances that choice. No matter what algorithm you use for counting up the rank orderings, no rank order voting system passes this test of equal weight. And actually, it's even more of a bummer. Nobel Prize winning economist, a guy named Kenneth Arrow, years ago, decades ago, wrote a famous theorem called the impossibility theorem. And what he proved is that with rank orderings alone, it's actually impossible to construct a fair election system. And this really just like depressed voting scientists for like 50 years. They're like, oh gosh, democracy is impossible. But it turns out that there's another entirely different class of voting systems that don't suffer these absolutely horrible defects. And the funny thing is we use them all the time. So think about Olympic judging, or rating a product on Amazon, or even the simple like on Facebook, right? All of these are examples of rating, where you attribute to each competitor or idea or product an independent measure of value. And so the really cool thing about the rating systems is that unlike the ranking systems, for every rating that you give to a candidate, I can give a balancing rating. 0 stars to your 5, or I can say yes to your no. So unlike the rank order systems, all the rating systems actually pass that test for equality of weight. And even the very simplest rating system, which is just, again, that binary yes or no, like or not, lets us communicate something that no rank ordering can, which is which candidates on the ballot do we actually approve of? Which ones do we actually like? And that ballot for that simplest rating system looks exactly the same as the ballot that we use today, just with the single choice limitation removed. So this isn't just theory. There was a 2012 exit poll done in New York City by Occupy to compare different alternate voting methods. And what they found was really stunning. So this study basically completely substantiates the theory that limit of one choice overwhelmingly advantages the two best funded major party candidates. So participants were asked to recast their presidential votes using our current system and then using a variety of alternate voting methods, including approval voting on each candidate. And the results are striking, right? Even though the district clearly doesn't philosophically represent the American public as a whole, what the data show quite clearly is that limit of one choice overwhelmingly favors the red and the blue who have the most cash. And that if voters have the opportunity to actually have an equal choice on each candidate, that all the candidates get a much more accurate measure of support. And this is backed by credible research. The field of voting science has advanced considerably in the last 200 years since the founding of the country. This chart excerpts the results of the simulation and analysis of more than 50 different voting methods done by a guy named Warren Smith, a Princeton-trained PhD in mathematics. And according to his analysis, equal, that is, rated voting methods, capture the top 4 spots according to both measures of voting system efficacy in terms of simulation. So that first column is what's called the Condorcet winner. And the Condorcet winner, if this guy in France long ago came up with this concept, his name was Condorcet. He came up with this concept of the Condorcet winner. The Condorcet winner is the candidate who would beat every other candidate in the race if it were just a head-to-head competition. The other measure is more of a sort of a simulation of net social regret at the outcome of the election. But according to both measures, the systems that actually provide an equal weight vote to all the voters win over every single other system that humans have ever come up with and characterized. So number 41 on the list, that's the California system. So our current system is so bad that it's sort of impossible to even simulate because it shuts out so many of the voters and in terms of how it divides it in the first stage. California system, number 41 on the list. But if all you do is take away that limit of one choice in the first stage, it jumps up to number 2 on the list. You can make it better by increasing the resolution of that scoring in the first stage. So instead of a binary choice, maybe you get 5 stars, or maybe you get to do 10 out of 10, but that requires a new kind of ballot. So the simplest way to make a top 2 system awesome and actually equal is simply to just remove that single choice limitation in the first phase, so that instead of making one choice per office, you actually have to look at each candidate on the ballot individually and say, do I like this candidate or not? Without having to say, how much money has she raised? Does the media say he's electable? Right? You just get to look at the candidate and think, I like, support. And because we know that to advance, we actually benefit by supporting at least 2, right? So you can always support your true favorite. And if there's just sort of like a merely acceptable candidate, you can support that one too. So that in the general election, you'd be afforded the choice potentially of the more awesome of 2 greats instead of always having to choose the lesser of the 2 evils. So also, unlike almost every other primary election system out there, because of that equal choice, you're actually strongly disincentivized from being dishonest, right? So the whole idea that you would, I'm just going to support a weak opponent makes no sense at all. You run the risk, if you support a weak opponent, of knocking your own favorite out of the game. So it's a system that actually promotes honest voting. And that's why we started the Equal Vote Coalition. It's really to talk about not just the particular dialogue on this measure, but to really frame a deep understanding. Because although the measure has these sort of broad words about equality, the measure itself doesn't define what that means. Now, the campaign has gone back and helped enlighten that in the voters' pamphlets by saying that actually both the spoiler effect inequality and the exclusion of the partisan primary are inequalities in the franchise that this measure requires to be fixed. But the purpose of this coalition is really to gather people together to say, yes, actually, we do want an equal vote amongst all the people. This is what that means. And should the measure pass, this is what we would like our legislature to enact. So Oregon, as we know, is a pioneer state. The initiative and referendum system itself was for many years nationally known as the Oregon system because we were the ones who did it first. Same thing with the bottle bill, with beach access, with vote by mail, with our system of land use planning that's trimmed, that kind of excess and blight of sprawl. Something that's really cool is that US national elections have only ever used rank order voting systems, which means that the equal vote could be another very significant Oregon first. And just perhaps we might get to see what a government of the people, by the people, and for the people actually looks like.